Good evening. I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator here at the Mark Twain House and Museum. Thanks for joining us. I'm happy to welcome all of you to this author talk for The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of American History by Ned Blackhawk. First, I want to thank our sponsors. These include Connecticut Humanities, the Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development, Ainsworth Charitable Foundation, Bank of America, the Greater Hartford Arts Council's United Arts Campaign, the Hartford, the Mark Twain Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and Travelers. I also want to take a chance to encourage you all to consider becoming a member. All members receive free admission to our author programs, the house and museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and more. Please let me know if you're interested. You could also do that at the front desk. Now on to our guest. Ned Blackhawk is the Howard R. Lamar Professor of History and American Studies at Yale University, where he is the faculty coordinator for the Yale Group for the Study of Native America. Dr. Blackhawk is an enrolled member of the Temoac tribe of Western Shoshone Indians of Nevada. A graduate of McGill University, he holds graduate degrees in history from UCLA and the University of Washington. He is also the author or co-editor of 4 books in Native American and Indigenous history, including Violence Over the Land, Indians, and Empires in the Early American West, which won 7 professional awards, including the Frederick Jackson Turner Prize for the most significant first book in U.S. history, awarded by the Organization of American Historians. He is also the author of the first State of the Field essay on Native American history, commissioned by the American Historical Association. Dr. Blackhawk has worked closely with museum communities and published in exhibition catalogs for the National Museum of the American Indian, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, in the Yale University Art Gallery. Now that I've made the proper introductions, I'll turn this over to Dr. Blackhawk. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that kind and generous introduction, Omar, and thank you all for coming. It's really my distinct privilege and pleasure to be here, and I have to extend my appreciation as well to my colleague, Carrie Driscoll, who is going to moderate a conversation about this project. So she came down very recently with some sudden health concerns that have limited her ability to participate in this evening's, what I hope will be profitable time together. But I wanted to share my appreciations to her, as well as my potential interest in returning potentially to the Twain House to have a conversation with her about Twain's visions of Native peoples more broadly. She is the author of a really seminal study of Mark Twain and Native peoples that I think would be, a helpful kind of continuation of perhaps some of the themes we might look at this evening. So thank you for the invitation and for coming. If this were, I almost felt like doing somewhat of a Twain impression or some form of a kind of physical comedic exercise coming through here, because I've had actually a very long-standing relationship with Mark Twain, as many of us have, that makes his life and legacy a bit complicated for a Native American from Nevada, where he first uses the term Mark Twain in February of 1863 during the Civil War in the Territorial Enterprise newspaper in Virginia City, which is upon the traditional homelands of some of the Western Shoshone's somewhat historic rivals, the Paiute Indians in Nevada. But nonetheless, there is a kind of long-standing imprint that Twain's legacy has on really everyone who's from Nevada. or spent time there. And it's not uncommon to see impersonators, murals, his name kind of emblazoned upon the region. And I write a little bit about this in my first book, which is a history of the Great Basin, or the Intermountain West, which was obviously inspired in part by our family and tribal history therein. Because his first book, Roughing It, includes a lot of somewhat challenging representations of indigenous peoples, both in the Great Basin, but also in Hawaii, where he leaves California for 6 months. I can't remember exactly when he leaves San Francisco, but he also goes to Hawaii at the end of the book in 1866. So those representations are hard to kind of make sense of and kind of deal with at various times. But nonetheless, his legacy and presence is so well commemorated here at this facility, which I'm just getting to know, that I'm destined to return in some form or another. So maybe with some students, colleagues, or perhaps in another more sustained, focused academic capacity like I hope to provide here this evening. So I was going to have a conversation about my new book called The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History, which came out a few weeks ago, and has been kind of the focus of parts of my attention for a few weeks now. And it was an undertaking of some considerable time and energy. And so I often think of it as an undertaking that began a long time ago at various earlier stages of my career and personal life. And so it's really kind of gratifying, obviously, to be at this point, to reflect on it and to think about it. It does try to do certain things, and I'm somewhat mindful of all the things it doesn't do. And so I want to just kind of share briefly the kind of overall intent, structure, and form for those who might be interested. I think it does a lot of important things. It's far from, obviously, from comprehensive. It's a big subject, Native American history. America's oldest historical field of inquiry that predates the arrival of non-Native peoples by countless generations. So this story is so fundamental to the history of North America that it will never actually be completed. It will always be an ongoing form of inquiry of various kinds. But in the same token or vein, it's been one of the least appreciated fields of American historical inquiry. And only recently, in the last maybe 15, 25 years or so, has it kind of broken into the kind of national sphere, at least within the Academy of Professional Visibility and Recognition. I call that breaking the rediscovery of America. Because I think actually there's a profound paradigmatic shift that's occurred around our relationship as a nation with the Native histories of much, if not yet all, American states and regions. But a profound shift has occurred in which U.S. historians, particularly of early American history and Western American history, have rediscovered an essential element of the nation's past that has historically been either elided, erased, or misunderstood. So there's been tremendously generative academic and scholarly attention to the subject, making my work and career very kind of exciting and at times rewarding, because there's been lots of conferences and publications and opportunities for engagement that weren't present when I entered the academy a long time ago. So I like to think of myself as part of this generation that has rediscovered American history. But in this kind of proliferation of academic, if not yet public attention, there's been there's been still a lot of tremendous, I don't want to say resistance in the kind of formal sense, even though that's happening as well, but there's been really an inability to reconcile the kind of current understandings that academics have about these subjects with the received knowledge that so many of us have been inculcated with. We've kind of been miseducated, essentially, about the nation's past for so long and so kind of thoroughly that we lack in many ways some of the kind of elemental entryways into this subject. And in my field, or in the profession largely, when there's too much information, people will just continue doing the same thing rather than stopping and kind of paying attention or retraining or rethinking. And so it's kind of the incumbent responsibility of Native American studies scholars, several of whom my colleagues from UConn have come, Andy Grande and Chris Newell are here. We're kind of all trying at various ways to break into these paradigms of received knowledge and recast assumptions about place, about nation, about what we'll call sovereignty, what constitutes this American body politic. So in that effort, I noticed a long time ago, when I'd go to my bookshelves to find an answer to a question, there weren't any answers. And I have to figure it out. One of the kind of, and then I became a teacher, and that's when this kind of project really took off, was when I realized there was nothing really good to teach undergraduates in Native American history. There's a lot of work, but you can't teach 35 books in 12 weeks or something. So you choose one or two or three, maybe, and some other things. But there's no common textbook. And the actual leading textbook is a book of documents called First Peoples by my colleague and really the dean of Native American history for the last 40 years, Colin Calloway at Dartmouth College. He edited a book in the late 90s called First Peoples, which is a documentary collection, which is good, but doesn't provide a lot of the interpretive, argumentative kind of avenues of entry that we were just discussing. Like many textbooks, sometimes textbooks foreclose, or they answer questions rather than pose them, which is important. But so there was never really a kind of entryway to recommend to people. You recommend lots of entryways. From the Southwest, we can talk about these subjects. If we're in the Northwest, we can talk about these subjects. If we're in California now, there's more literature. So we were building a kind of regionally centered understanding of the field that lacks sometimes national cohesion or unification. So at that point, I decided, at some point, I would try to write a single volume interpretive overview of Native American history. And it's now entitled The Rediscovery of America. And it's divided in half. And it doesn't try to make sense, and that's one of its major limitations, of the kind of pre-Columbian Native American historical experience. Because I'm also not trained in archaeology, but it's often treated so poorly and simplified that it has yet to, in my mind, create sufficient momentum to be sufficiently intelligible to someone like myself. So I could have tried to become an archaeologist in the middle of my career and tried to make sense of the debates around the abandonment of the Mississippian mountains communities, or the southwestern pre-Columbian village worlds, or the coastal economies of the northwest coast, and so forth. I could have done that kind of work, but I would have missed the ambition that guided me, which was to try to make sense of the integrity of Native American history as a single unified field. Does it have a unified field? If so, what are the unified themes? So I came to the kind of conclusion that I would try to harness the scholarly insights of rediscovery and kind of distill them into temporal and regional analyses. And historians practice studies of change over time and do so in particular places. And so what are the kind of primary changes over time that are emblematic throughout Native American historical experience? Those changes generally are most identifiable in their origins with the arrival of Europeans, particularly in the Caribbean, starting in the 1490s. So the first chapter in this book is on the Spanish borderlands and the kind of world of the Spanish Empire as it kind of formed in the Caribbean and Mexico and spread north into the southwest of the United States, where it encountered 81 Pueblo village communities, 32 of whom I believe remain the longest continuously inhabited places in North America. Small fact, right? But I would press my colleagues in U.S. history to identify a sufficient text that makes that just very simple observation. Right, these are the longest continuously inhabited places in our country. We really haven't been taught much about them. So to understand that history, the chapter 1 is part of this attempt in the first half of the book to understand the arrival of Europeans. So the first half of the book, which is chapters 1 through 6, is called Indians and Empires, which is a huge now field of academic inquiry. My first book is subtitled Indians and Empires in the Early American West. My advisor's book is called subtitled Indians, Empires, and Republics in the Great Lakes region. So this theme of Indians and Empires is evident. And so it's really, in the first half, a distillation of, or partial distillation of several of these themes. I was really partially gratified to be able to make sense in my own mind for the first time of the relationships here in New England between Puritan colonists and indigenous peoples in the native Northeast. Not as thoroughly as I would have liked, but sufficiently well to kind of introduce a kind of alternative perspective to Puritan history in what is still by far the most studied region of American historical inquiry in the Northeast. So that's the first half. And so the Spanish, French Empire in chapter 3, the making of the French Empire is heavily impacted by the presence of the largest and oldest political confederacy in North America, the Iroquois Confederacy, or Haudenosaunee League of 5 and later 6 nations. Their history is well understood in the field of early American history, but not perhaps outside of it. There's a series of arguments in those chapters that make a claim that the French and their indigenous allies across what becomes known as New France, though the St. Lawrence from November to April looks nothing like France to me. It's kind of a somewhat optimistic sentiment to think that they are somehow near a Mediterranean informed climate of any kind. So that's a little bit of a joke to keep. But there's an argument about the kind of centrality of indigenous imperial relations to the formation of New France, which is the largest colony in North American history. Again, a small detail that maybe hasn't been sufficiently conveyed to, a non-academic / national audience. It stretched from the mouth of the St. Lawrence to trading relationships, at least along the upper Missouri with the Mandan, where French traders started arriving in the 1730s. It's like, 2,000 miles. And from the north, near Hudson's Bay, to the mouth of the Mississippi. Big empire. A lot of Indians, right? So the world of that empire has not been sufficiently recognized outside of academic circles, even within them. Jill Lepore's recent book called These Truths, A History of the United States, delegates maybe a paragraph to the French Empire in North America. I have 2 chapters, each of which is perhaps collectively 100 pages. So I'll try not to fall into some kind of academic conversation or disagreement that may not be too interesting to non-specialists. But the sentiments are still there, as you might sense. So the French Empire's imprint on North American history was deeply familiar to the founders of this republic, who rebelled against the British Empire, which had inherited the French Empire in North America at the Treaty of Paris in 1763. And Colin Calloway Dartmouth has a great book called The Stroke of a Pen. At the stroke of a pen, the British Empire in North America doubled in 1763, inheriting the former French Empire. And it's in that moment, at the end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5, that really this field's potential collective power is perhaps most, at least, identifiable or manifest. Because there's been a generation of, even more, a generation of academics who said the following, that the imperial crisis that comes to pervade the British Empire in North America between its settler subjects and its crown begins not in the seaports, not in Boston Harbor, not in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, let alone New York or among the Virginia gentry. It starts in the interior, in these spaces that the British have inherited from the French and where native peoples have been not defeated during the previous 7 Years' War. A whole 20-year, 30-year historiography, we would call it, has made that claim. It's been insufficiently carried outside of academic circles. That's the intent of chapter 5, called the Indigenous, or it's called Settler Uprising, the Indigenous Origins of the American Revolution, and begins in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, which began in the interior backcountry regions when Washington is trying to take a French fort known as Duquesne that will later be called Pittsburgh. He's way out of his league the summer of 1754. He kind of is defeated at Fort Necessity, surrenders ironically on July 4th, heads back to Virginia, and then the British Crown mobilizes for war. And another subsequent attempt to take Duquesne will come the following summer in 1755 under General Braddock, and Washington will accompany Braddock, and Braddock will be killed, as will over 60% of his men, and Washington will have to retreat back again to Virginia because the interior is too powerful. It's filled with Indians and Frenchmen. So that's the reality of this history that was imprinted on people like our nation's first president, who understood that this world needed a certain type of governance. And so when the Republic is formed after the Revolution, I kind of skipped a little bit how the Revolution started, but the Republic is formed, they will create a new government to help manage the interior. Because the first government, the Articles of Confederation, weren't working, or wasn't working. And in that new government, Indians had to be managed by a federalist system, the national government. So all the colonies turned states cede their authority to the federal government in the Constitutional Convention, which provides the new government the capacity to regulate trade and commerce with foreign nations, between the states and with Indian tribes. And those 5 words, I often tell my students or others who will listen to me, yourselves included now this evening, that these are the 5 most important words in American Indian history. Because it lodged in the Constitution that the federal government, and the federal government alone, has the kind of diplomatic responsibility of managing Indian affairs. So this will be a subject throughout American history that will be outside of the jurisdiction of states. And initially for a century or so, outside even the jurisdiction of Congress or the House of Representatives. And treaties and treaty making, which are also lodged into the supremacy clause in the Constitution, are the kind of bilateral manifestation of this history. That's the first half of the book. The second half of the book is since this moment of 1787, since the Constitution is founded. and I could kind of go through like Jacksonian America and the early Republic. And I don't want to take up too much time because I'd love to have a conversation if needed. But since we're in the Twain Museum, it may be helpful to know that Twain's arrival in the West was heavily shaped by the Civil War and the growth of mining industries across the West. And so chapter, I can't remember what it is. Chapter 9 is called Collapse and Total War, the Indigenous West and the Civil War Era. And it looks at Western mining during the Civil War and makes a series of kind of claims about how many of the Civil War's largest changes came away from the battlefield, including a uniquely 19th century form of settler colonialism, mining. With reckless abandon, miners seized lands, resources, and indigenous lives in a process of dispossession that shadowed the nation's war effort. Indeed, am I right? If I can put myself into my own presentation there. Western mining initiated a torrent of ecological changes that refashioned Native America and subsidized the Union's total mobilization for total war. So as a Native American historian and tribal member from Nevada, I'm interested in what happens during this period. Economically, mines contributed untold millions to the nation's economy. Starting in 1859, shortly after the Colorado Gold Rush, the Nevada Comstock Lode, where Twain arrives in 63, he arrives in Carson City earlier, but tries speculating in the California and Sierra Highlands shortly thereafter. His brother Orion, I used to call it Orion. Apparently in Missouri it's pronounced Orion. His brother Orion had been appointed, as some of us may know, by the Lincoln administration, the territorial secretary for the new Nevada territory. And Orion is very active in the state's efforts, or the territory's efforts to become a state. And there is an untold history of the Clemens brothers that I don't know if I'd ever have the capacity to research, but I'm intrigued by this moment of statehood that's occurring in Nevada, which becomes the Silver State, as many of us may know, in 1864. So, starting in 1859, Nevada's Comstock Lode produced $292 million in its 2 decades of operations, with $30 million generated in 1864. Those are in monetary terms of the time, which I don't have like a easy Google access here, but if you did a kind of Google calculated estimate of what 292 in 1860 or 30 million in 1864, it's a lot of money, right? Arizona to the south, its mines, according to a political leader in the region, were, quote, unsurpassed in richness, number, and extent by any in the world. Most Western territories, in fact, witnessed not one but multiple gold rushes. Colorado, Montana, and later Wyoming had 40 among them. Banks, newspapers, post office, bars, hotels, casinos, and other services followed as white men from across the continent flooded west. This mining deluge shaped the fortune of a generation of young men, including America's most famous writer, who headed west during the war. Leaving Missouri for Nevada was, quote, the turning point of my life, remarked Samuel Clemens in 1910. One determined, as he wrote, by circumstance, after, quote, my brother Orion was appointed secretary of the new territory of Nevada. This is from his recently published autobiography, or released. Is it recent anymore? Feels kind of recent, right? He apparently put a 100-year hiatus on the publication of his autobiography. 2010, so relatively recently. I write, and I don't know how true this is or not, but it seems evident that the Clement brothers moved west and avoided conscription. They left Missouri, a divided border state, in the summer of 1861 and crossed the continent via stagecoach. They arrived at the eastern slope of the Sierras, where Orion worked to facilitate Nevada's transition to statehood. The younger Samuel assisted as best he could. As territorial leaders debated the terms of potential statehood meetings held in Carson City, Samuel hauled wood with local Paiute laborers. His future, however, was not in politics or mining. I could not endure the heavy labor, he wrote in his autobiography. I could never learn to swing a long-handled shovel. Samuel's future was in printing, which had been one of his earliest trades. Moving to Virginia City, home of the Comstock Lode, Clemens worked at the Territorial Enterprise. He used the pseudonym Mark Twain, an identity he had invented in the mining district. He spent the remainder of the war in Nevada and California mines and developed a jocular vernacular and literary style that launched a profitable career after Reconstruction. We're in the Twain house, so I did decide to kind of emphasize that. One of the potential criticisms that I see in this project is that whenever I talk about it, or I'm often talking about non-native people, right? We just talked a little bit about mines and Mark Twain and George Washington, so one of the concerns that I want to kind of remedy with that recognition is to highlight Native American reactions and responses and activisms to these challenges, which is easier done in certain periods of time than in others. So the last two chapters of this book kind of move past somewhat familiar paradigms of American Indian history. The Civil War includes sets of state-driven campaigns against Native peoples. The largest mass execution in U.S. history at Mankato following the Dakota War of 1862. The California campaigns that spill over into the Southwest and the Great Basin, as well as onto the plains at places like Sand Creek. The Long Walk of the Navajo, their internment for 4 years at Fort Sumner along the Bosque Redondo, and their inability to return to their homelands following the campaigns of Christopher Carson. Those are the familiar dimensions of portions of Native American history that one could find in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee or other places. There's a period also about the growing power of the federal government, the removal of Indian children from their homes as part of an assimilation campaign, as well as the subdivision of reservation lands during a policy known as allotment. Chapter 10, I like to think, is compactly titled that may hopefully carry a certain level of resonance. It's simply titled Taking Children in Treaty Lands. Because that's what the federal government does during Reconstruction afterwards. It takes children and takes their treaty lands. So these are the somewhat familiar themes of Native American history that set a prelude, I hope, for a slightly more focused effort on Native American activists, intellectuals, thinkers, community leaders who are struggling very heavily to make sense of what to do in this incredible transformative challenge that has not quite, but nearly destabilized their lives entirely. And so this then is a theme of what we call reservation era historiography. How destabilized are these communities? Some emphasize resiliency, endurance, adaptation. Others highlight extraction, destabilization. So those are the kind of debates that are also kind of filtering around these subjects. So I tried to kind of make sense of Native American intellectual and political activist responses to these. And so chapter 11 is entitled Indigenous Twilight at the Dawn of the Century, Native Activists and the Myth of Indian Disappearance. It kind of opens with the very familiar, I think, understandings of how many historians, anthropologists, writers, fair organizers, early American photographers, artists, university leaders, museum directors, everyday people were convinced that Indians were disappearing. And it's no coincidence, and it's linked to the pattern of the federal government's assimilation efforts. There was a widespread kind of consensus that Native peoples would not survive into the modern American Republic. That's a theme that many contemporary Native Americans are still dealing with and trying to challenge. So it's not uncommon to hear people say, we're still here, exhibits. And so one of the really nice things about the new hardback, which I'd only seen in galley proofs, is that we're able to put maps on the front in papers. I worked with some students during the pandemic to finish these maps, and I couldn't find a map of contemporary Native and federally recognized Native nations and lands in the contiguous United States. And was able to draw upon a series of maps to fashion one. And so you can't see from a distance. Hopefully you might take a closer look. But there are hundreds of contemporary state and federally recognized Native nations and lands in the contiguous United States. So the maps in the book kind of makes one of the arguments of the book more broadly in some form. But these ideologies of indigenous disappearance remain so pervasive that arguing against them was often futile. Even seemingly positive commemorations often offered variants on this pernicious dogma. Apparently, New York City attempted to build a, quote, National American Indian Memorial in its harbor that would be larger than the Statue of Liberty, and did so because, quote, the Indian race, whose practical disappearance from the continent can be but a matter of a few more years, should be perpetuated, at least in memory. As suffragist Anna Howard Shaw remarked upon the unveiling of a statue of Sacagawea at the Lewis and Clark Centennial and American Pacific Exhibition and Oriental Fair in Portland, that's a mouthful, as she remarked, your tribe is fast disappearing from the land of your fathers. May we, the daughters of an alien race who slew your people and usurped your country, learn the lessons of calm endurance in our efforts to lead men through the paths of justice. Confronting such representations strained Native American leaders, particularly in a group known as the Society of American Indians. In its final years, the SAI shifted their attention to Washington and spent increased time hosting delegations and lobbying Congress to achieve citizenship. A prominent leader named Zeke Lassa, a Dakota Society founder, for example, moved from Utah's Fort Duchesne Reservation to Washington, D.C. itself in 1917 to lead lobbying efforts. The Society's annual meeting in 1919, or at the Society's annual meeting in 1919, the theme was, quote, American citizenship for the Indians. There's a fairly extended discussion hereafter about citizenship and where Native peoples actually stood within the federal government's relationships. But Zeke Lassa, Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who's an Oneida Indian leader from the early 20th century, and a Winnebago leader from Nebraska, and his partner, an Ojibwe leader from Minnesota, they decided to do something a little bit different, but related to combat this pernicious dogma of indigenous disappearance. Their names were Henry Roe Cloud and Elizabeth Bender Cloud. Roe Cloud had graduated Yale in 1910, so part of my interest in him is somewhat deep-seated and I like to think personal. Born and raised on the Winnebago or Ho-Chunk Reservation, Nebraska, within a community recently removed from its Wisconsin homelands, he was the only commissioner on the most important congressional study of Native American policy, authored, known as the Merriam Report or Commission of 1928. By 1928, he and Elizabeth Bender Cloud had each devoted 20 years to reforming federal Indian policy. Like other SAI members, they hoped to reverse assimilation and institute policies that would strengthen tribal autonomy. There is a close relationship between the loss of land and the health and prosperity of the Indian people, Roe Cloud stated in a speech at Pine Ridge, South Dakota. Improving, quote, the health and prosperity of the Indian people became the Cloud's lifetime commitment. Even before Roe Cloud had joined this commission, the Clouds developed practices that challenged the mythology of Indian disappearance. They did so by educating students at the American Indian Institute, which opened in 1915 in Wichita, Kansas, and transformed a generation of students. They ran the school until fundraising became too challenging during the Great Depression. The Clouds hoped to strengthen tribal capacities by educating young Indians differently. And they had planned to expand the school to include women before it closed. They emphasized academic pedagogy and also prioritized, rather than punished, as the boarding schools did, tribal knowledge. As articulated in the Merriam Report, the Clouds countered prevailing notions that, quote, some Indian children are not worthy of education. There is a kind of vocational theme in Native American educational history, where Indians have often been brought into educational institutions, often to run them in the kind of labor and manual laborers form. So the boarding schools would have various types of instruction, usually throughout the first half of the day, but the second half of the day, students worked. This institute that they founded, which I found, there's not that it's not non-existent, but I was very happy to see the press allow an aerial photograph of their institute, which they built in 1915 in Wichita. This institute hired Native children or teachers who incorporated oral traditions, folktales, and Indian languages into their curriculum. Roe Cloud urged students to analyze their own creation stories and to compare them with European folklore. Some, he noted, are, quote, romantic, some heroic, some satire, humor, and adventure, and a great many of them teach moral allegiance. The Clouds understood that the failures of Indian education were not intrinsic to Native people, but to the vocational punitive structures of boarding schools. As he wrote in 1914, quote, the difficulty lies in the system rather than the race. The Clouds knew this faulty system well. A graduate of Mount Herman School in Massachusetts and Yale University, Roe Cloud began his schooling at Nebraska's Winnebago Industrial School. At age 5, he had seen his older brother, quote, seized by police and taken away to school. The same soon happened to him. Washing clothes in the school laundry, however, did not provide much learning. And he, quote, nursed a growing hatred, unquote, of the monotony of vocational education. Quote, such work is not educative, he would later argue. It begets a hatred of work, especially when there is no pay. The Indian will work under such conditions only because he is under authority. Such, quote, industrial education exploited youth and did nothing to prepare them to, quote, grapple with their community's problems. Elizabeth Bender was from northern Minnesota near the White Earth Reservation. One of 10 children, she attended Catholic school at age 10 before being sent to Pipestone Industrial School, which is in Minnesota. As she recalled, I had 2 sisters and 2 brothers there. We had to spend a term of 3 years before we were allowed to return home. In 1903, she joined 4 siblings at Hampton Institute, which is in Virginia, and was famous for educating both freed freedmen, or former African American slaves and their children, as well as Native people. While each had spent time in faraway institutions, the Clouds maintained ties to their families and tribal communities. They returned in summers and whenever they could. They also became devoted to other Native peoples in their new environments. They hoped to form what one scholar has termed hubs for intellectual and social development, using new social relationships in their advocacy. I kind of continue looking at some of their efforts before getting to the Great Depression. And we'll conclude just very briefly with talking about that fateful year of 1929, which brought tragedy to countless American families, including the Clouds, who suffered a very personal loss as well. Their only son, Henry Jr., died of pneumonia at age 3. They commemorated his life and engraved above the fireplace at the Institute home, "To the memory of little Henry and the glory of all childhood." Love for family and other Native people guided the Clouds during the Institute's operations. "Never be ashamed that you are an American Indian or native of Alaska," Cloud told the graduating class of 1949's Mount Edgecombe School in Alaska. Such love and pride stood in perpetual contrast to boarding schools and their indiscriminate and arbitrary authority. Cloud used to travel around for the government a lot to conduct surveys and kind of investigate. And he also lobbied, some of us might know about the Indian Reorganization Act. He also often lobbied for its approval within reservation communities. So he reported from the Rosebud boarding school in South Dakota, for example, that conditions were awful and punishment severe. Runaways were common. Several boys, he wrote, quote, "froze to death by running away. This year, 3 girls ran away. One girl was made to carry a ball and chain around her ankle and push a wheelbarrow for hours in front of the whole school as her punishment." Breaking the punitive structure of education was imperative. Upon his appointment in 1933 as superintendent of Haskell Indian Institute, which is in Lawrence, Kansas, and I think has trained more Indian students than any other boarding school or former boarding school, and is now known as Haskell Indian Nations University, which has a dedicated dormitory in honor of Henry Cloud. So upon his appointment as superintendent of Haskell in 1933, he instituted new philosophies and practices. In his first act, he closed the Haskell jail, a common feature of the military-styled facilities established by Richard Henry Pratt and other boarding school leaders. He dismissed school employees known for their harsh discipline and broke Haskell's long-standing ties with the local National Guard unit, which had supplied military uniforms, officers, and drilling equipment, which other schools also followed. A new era at the institution had begun. And in 1935, after only 2 years as superintendent, he helped 28 students gain admission to the University of Kansas. These kind of somewhat quotidian, individualistic kind of portraits of individuals confronting these ideologies, these policies, are kind of continued throughout the 30s, throughout the Second World War, particularly into the Cold War era, where a new kind of assimilative policy known as termination is instituted by the federal government to break up reservations, send families and young people away through a one-way migration practice known as relocation, and essentially to get out of the business of Indian affairs, to solve the Indian problem once and for all. That's chapter 12. I could kind of keep going, but I think we've kind of perhaps sufficiently learned of the structure, the intent, some of the findings, some of the potential insights that are at the heart of this new project. So I think I'll conclude there, and thank you for your sustained attention, and I'm happy if needed to have a continued conversation a little more informally. Hey.
Ned, do you want to take any questions? We have a few minutes.
I'm happy to. I know we come at this subject from varying levels of familiarity and or awareness, but I'm happy to hear any potential reactions and or answer any questions. Here's a question.
Oh.
There's a mic here if you'd like. And there's also like, I don't know, a few dozen people on some internet somewhere, so let's use the microphone to
well,
so they can hear.
I was wondering, so you talk about empires and, versus indigenous people, but do you talk about indigenous people as an imperial force like you see in Central America, or even the Haudenosaunee are an almost imperial force as well?
I don't use that term per se, but other scholars have, somewhat famously in my world, and they may have overextended that use in more recent publications. But I don't. But I am very cognizant in this project and in my other work of the kind of intra-indigenous dynamics that, or inter-indigenous dynamics that. Are also at the heart of this subject. So even though the vast preponderance of this book studies the relationship between indigenous peoples and either European empires and or the American nation state, there's somewhat of a heavy influence, or there's a heavy, influence isn't the right word, but there's a heavy emphasis on the tensions between and within regional Native communities. And so I could give some examples but in the north, among the Iroquois, for example, the French are allied with the Iroquois' historic enemies, the Montagnais and other Algonquin-speaking peoples, who enlist the French very quickly in military campaigns against the Confederacy, particularly the Mohawks, who are the eastern door of the Iroquois Confederacy. So in 1613, there's a famous print of Champlain's battles against the Mohawks that are done in some of his published works. And so and some scholars call this a relatively quiet period of Iroquoian history because they realize that they're not actually positioned well to take on the French and their Indian allies anymore in battle. I think someone calls them the quiet years, a guy named Bruce Trigger. But the Iroquois then start doing other things much closer to here. They start monopolizing the Dutch fur trade for themselves, driving other regional peoples, some Algonquin speaking, from western Massachusetts and New England away from the Dutch trading posts along the Hudson. And so very quickly the Iroquois through the Mohawk are able to monopolize the Dutch and then return to New France armed with better guns than actually the French have, because the Dutch are less uncomfortable trading guns with Indians than the French ever were. And so then a series of incredibly violent and protracted campaigns redefined Eastern North America from roughly 1635 to 1670, 1680, that are very, very far-reaching. So this chapter 3, which is entitled The Unpredictability of Violence, which is intending to say, yes, these are violent histories, but no, they were never ordained to be, predetermined. And that there is this kind of revolutionary transformation that is unleashed unpredictably when European settlers arrive and begin trading not just guns, but knives and metals and other weapons, horses in the West later, to indigenous peoples who then incorporate them into their worlds, use them for their own purposes, and often become, as I think you're suggesting, powerful in ways that we may not be sufficiently aware of, but the Europeans whom they dominated often were, including the French. And so I was just shocked to hear that the French monarchy got involved in this. My sense from being educated in these subjects is that these are not great powers subjects. These are social histories. These are community studies. These are, small, essentially, historical subjects. But Louis XIV, the Sun King, sends his best battalion to New France with the object in 1663, 1664 to, quote, destroy the Iroquois, which they're unable to do. So then the Grand Settlement, which is a huge peace settlement in 1701, occurs in Montreal, and that's the end of chapter 3, the beginning of chapter 4. And so these are kind of central themes that one can't see only in somewhat, I use the term binary, but in somewhat oppositional form. So Indians and empires, and in many ways, Europeans could become part of native communities as well, incorporated and allied with. And there's some, especially in the French Empire, which had a very different social practices than. And there's a painting, or the images also. The images try to do some of the analytical work that I've tried to gesture towards. But there's a, chapter 4 is called The Native Inland Sea, the Struggle for the Heart of the Continent. 1701, there's that date again, to 1755. And it includes a painting from 1780 by a German immigrant in Quebec that shows the relatively similar ware, cooking implement of Indians and French people. Because there's this kind of heavy emphasis in the literature that the French and the native worlds in the Great Lakes region became so kind of blurred that they couldn't really, you can't really pull them apart. And so when the French were expelled in 1763, that pre-existing world still remained. The British couldn't conquer it either. It would take a new republic, half a century, to do that kind of work. So that's one of the themes of the book. Thank you for that question. There's a question behind you as well.
Yeah, and if anyone online has any questions, please let us know.
I was wondering, because you're mostly using the term Indian, what is your feeling right now about the different names, Indian, Native American, and Indigenous?
Mm-hmm. That's usually like the first footnote in many Native American studies books, the use of the terminology. Some people have an entire kind of pretext page that kind of discusses this. I do use these terms somewhat interchangeably. And I don't really have a necessary preference for one than others, but I'm not ready to abandon terminology easily, unless I think there's reason to do so. And so one of the things about Indians that, even though it's so rooted in histories of simplification and hardship, and it's also like a doctrine of law. So the Title 25 code, I think it's the U.S. Code, Title 25 is simply called Indians. So if the federal government is using these terms, we kind of have to understand what they're talking about, because they may deny certain fundamental attributes of Native American politics and sovereign practice that we need to kind of stop them or be aware of. So Indians is still with us. And there is this kind of great debate occurring across much of our society about what to do with these past names and images and monuments. And there's no real resolution. But I think understanding what people at the time were doing in response to some of these things helps us. And I am part of a generation of academics who were doing American Indian studies, but who are now doing Native American and Indigenous studies. Same people. So that's kind of a fun. 2 questions here, and I think maybe that's probably the extent of our time. Yeah.
I was wondering,
Oh.
with the proliferation of information, your book, for example.
Thank you. So with proliferation of new research and new information, new publications like yours, how do you feel about where new museums stand in relation to the changes in history? I'm particularly thinking of the Smithsonian Institution, the new well, it's not new, probably like 10 years old now, but the museum down there.
Yeah. That's a great question. And sitting in the museum as we are, we, I think, understand the kind of vital role that these civic institutions kind of play in American life, and may not know of the kind of general transformations that you're talking about. And the largest gathering of American Indians in contemporary U.S. history so far in the 21st century was the opening of the National Museum of the American Indian, which opened in the September of 2004. One thing that there's a great collection edited by two Native scholars, Amy Lonetree and Amanda Cobb, called The National Museum of the American Indian: Critical Conversations. I've taught this book a few times. I teach Lonetree's also a book called Decolonizing Museums, about these museum subjects. One thing that the Cobb and Lonetree anthology exposes is that this museum, which was passed by Senate or congressional law called the National Museum of the American Indian Act in 1990, it was an extension of other efforts to lead towards the repatriation of Native American ancestral and funerary and cultural items of cultural patrimony, known as the Native American Graves Repatriation and Protection Act, or NAGPRO, also 1990. So Congress is doing two dramatic things in these areas in 1990, partly because of the activism of Native American community members who were trying to break away the proprietary hold that some of these institutions like the Smithsonian had or maintained. So in the Cobb anthology, there's a whole chapter on the reception of the museum. You know, maybe I should feel myself in good company here, because the museum was not well received in the New York Times the day after its opening, or the Washington Post. So there were these really scathing kind of reviews of the museum for its unfamiliarity. You know, they said, this is not a museum. This is more of a cultural center. I'm like, cool. Like, I love cultural centers. You know, we can do museums. You know, so there's this kind of dissonance between the kind of aspirations for some communities to reform and transform and/or rehabilitate museums, and other kind of more kind of conventional understandings of what these spaces should or could be. But it's a great dynamic conversation that's occurring all across North America, and we often in our field and look north to see what the Canadians are doing on some of these terms. And I was really just astonished around the 150th bicentennial, the sesquicentennial of the Canadian, is that independence? No, Confederation. Canada was part of Britain. Then it became by itself, still part of Britain, through a Commonwealth system. Sorry. No, but just trying to reach people who sometimes. And so in 1867, and then in 2013, they celebrated the sesquicentennial. Now, why are we talking about this? Because their National Gallery went through a major renovation shortly thereafter. And when it opened, it decided the only way it could do its national art was to have permanent galleries of Canadian and Indigenous art. So the National Gallery of Canada, which is their equivalent, we have the National Gallery of Art across from the National Museum of America. An interesting contrast there. In Canada, the National Gallery of Art, Canadian National Gallery of Art, includes Indigenous art in every one of its permanent galleries, and calls their gallery Canadian and Indigenous art. It's very complicated because there's this long-standing tension in Canada between around French-Canadian distinction and the recognition by the federal government and the national government therein. And so the signs of their permanent galleries are all in French and English, but they all say French, or they all say Canadian and Indigenous or Autochthone. And so somehow, and this is even interesting in the Canadian sphere, because the National Museum, or you should call it the Museum of Man, but they renamed it the Canadian National Museum of History, has had a giant entry hall that the tensions between the Anglophone and Francophone curators or designers couldn't reconcile. They then just turned the entry hall over to Native art. And so in this kind of interesting tension between, we might think in our own terms of a kind of the tensions we have over recognizing our country as perhaps multicultural versus biracial historical experience. In Canada, the Indigenous presence has kind of established a kind of recognition that is distinctive from what's happening in the United States. Question behind you. Thank you.
Well, I'm actually going to respond a little bit to the previous question, because as the executive director of this museum, I really want to thank Ned for being here, because Twain was a remarkably progressive person for his own time period when it came to race relations. He was somebody who believed in and funded reparations, and yet there is this giant wart, which is his inability to wrap his arms, figuratively or literally, around Indigenous peoples. And so it's really important for a museum to go to the most challenging, especially if it's a history museum, to go to the most challenging parts of its central themes and embrace them and talk about them. So we were supposed to have Carrie Driscoll here tonight. Her book about Twain's relations with Native Americans is not complimentary of those relations. It's a very good, strong, academic, in-depth look at what that was all about. So I'm sorry that Carrie isn't here to share that, but I'm really appreciative of Ned coming here and engaging with the museum as a place of both civic and civil discourse, and bringing in a topic, because we like to bring in a lot of different kinds of topics, a very diverse group of topics, but this is an important one for us. So, and I guess the observation that I was going to make was it was fascinating to me as you were talking about the breadth and depth of where Europeans were coming when you were starting off, Ned, that I was thinking how many different peoples, these very few European nations were coming here, but all these different peoples and all of these different cultural traditions that were spread amongst the native peoples in this country, and that's a big history to grab hold of in terms of the native history of this country. And I just wondered if you'd like to comment on that just a little bit more.
The challenge of bringing together.
So much diversity.
You know, that's why the maps I think I'm so pleased with, because not all the tribal communities who are on the maps are in the book. And I was just at a conference and I was working with a colleague who was working on the Crow Reservation of Montana. And I was someone mispronouncing Upsalaga, the Crow name for themselves. So it's one thing to read something, and another thing to know how to say it, right? And so I may not even be sufficiently conversant in the pronunciation of the first map, which are the estimated locations of select pre-removal native nations. This is an incredibly heterogeneous subject. And that's why it makes me so suspicious of non-heterogeneous portraits of American history. It's like, no, I'm sorry. And so I'm really kind of shocked when I am in academic spaces to find very well-informed and well-educated people who have never encountered these subjects in any shape or form. And so we've, kind of as a field, have had to kind of learn something and also fight back against the kind of conventional knowledges. So I am happy to be at the Mark Twain House. I'd be happy to come back and happy to talk and meet people hereafter. Yay! Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ned. The book is available for purchase at the museum store, and Ned will be signing books. If you're online, please purchase the book through our museum store online. Thank you so much.
Yay.